Alright, shalom to the Israelite community. This is a message from the Israelite Brotherhood. Alright, Israelites, man, like I constantly make videos stressing how we broke covenant. How we broke covenant and broke bad. It's only one history. It's only one history. You're not correct if your history or message not centered around we broke covenant. So, if you listening, Israelites, and if you trying to teach Israelite history, your history is not gonna be correct if you're not teaching that we broke covenant for Egyptian religion. If you ain't teaching that, then you're really not teaching Israelite history, man. A lot of Israelites skip the Tanakh history. Man, they skip the Tanakh history and go straight into the New Testament history. Man, they skip this history. And this is only one history. They skip this and then they go straight into New Testament era history and teach that. Well, that's incorrect. That's incorrect, and you're not correct when you teaching that. When you teaching history after the Babylonian wars and your message is not centered around how we broke covenant and how we end up in this position, then you're not teaching Israelite history. You're not teaching correct Israelite history, and then you teaching the people's history that we abandoned our heritage to during the Babylonian wars. We only have one history, and everything has to spring from it. You cannot line New Testament history up with the Tanakh history of us breaking covenant. It is no way, because we went into Africa during the Babylonian wars. We left the land. And went off into Africa. That's how we was enslaved from Africa. That's the only way that they can take us, from Africa, is that we come up off the promised land. We came up off the promised land, the land right here. We come up off this land and went into Africa around these parts. Around these parts. We got away from Egypt, but we was around these parts. And then that's how we got enslaved, and then brought to the Americas. So if you're not teaching history centered around we broke covenant for Egyptian religion, then you ain't teaching real Israelite history, and that you teaching history come off the other people's history, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. You teaching their history, and then you just trying to make it sound like it's our history, but you're not teaching real Israelite history if you teaching history after the Babylonian wars, because everything has to start from there. When we broke covenant, we only broke covenant one time, and that was during the Babylonian wars, when we said we didn't want to do the covenant no more, and we come up off the land to go into Egypt to do the Egyptian religion. That's what the book of Jeremiah is about. That's why it's so important to read it and get its understanding, because it's the last act for the 99%. Now, there was a little few Israelites that was captured and taken to Babylon, when we went into Africa, the 99%. But I show in history how they disappeared so fast. When they come back home, they got wiped out. They got wiped out real fast. Because, it couldn't be two covenants, one broken and one not broken. So, that'll be this history right here. But even this history from these books right there and these individuals centered around the book of Jeremiah and how we broke covenant. These books couldn't have come about. These individuals' history couldn't come into existence if it wasn't for us breaking covenant in the book of Jeremiah. So it's important to understand that we only have one history where we broke the covenant, and that was during the Babylonian era when we went into Africa to do the Egyptian religion. And then this history sprang up. These books sprang up. But these books and these individual prophets couldn't give their message. It wouldn't be no message from them if we wouldn't had broke the covenant during the Babylonian wars in the book of Jeremiah. So if you teaching any other history that don't line up with this, then your history is going to be incorrect. And it's no way around it. It's no way around it. You cannot talk about no 10 lost tribes and then try to create a history from that. You cannot talk about we ran into Africa in 70 AD and try to create a history off that. That's all incorrect because it never was any 10 lost tribes. I show that in the book of Hezekiah, in Hezekiah's history in 2 Chronicles 30, and also in King Josiah's history, 2 Chronicles 34. You see that the Israelites were still there. We were still home, and then comes the Babylonian wars. Then comes the Babylonian wars, and then that's when we come off the land willingly. We willingly left the land, breaking the covenant. So if your history is not centered around that, then you can't use these other books to try to explain Israelite history because it has to go back to the Babylonian wars when we broke the covenant for Egyptian religion, when we said we wasn't going to do the covenant no more. So therefore, that calls for all the curses to fall down on us and for us to get enslaved in Africa and brought to the Americas for our punishment. So if your history don't line up with we broke the covenant for Egyptian religion, then your history gonna be off. You're not teaching real Israelite history. If you try to jump to the New Testament era and explain how we the Israelites, then you're not doing real Israelite history. You doing the invaders' history because it has to go back to the book of Jeremiah where we broke the covenant and ran into Africa. Now, those peoples in the New Testament, they're not us because it's a whole change of belief and a whole different belief system that is not related to these individuals, Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, Nehemiah, and Malachi's history when we worship one Yah. And how they was never told about no demigod coming to save and change anything that Almighty Yah had set forth from the beginning, saying that if we break the covenant, what was going to happen. So if your history don't line up with the book of Jeremiah, teaching it, and now you could teach off it because, from there, we broke covenant and went into Africa, and then you can go into all these other books because all these other books come after that act. The act in Jeremiah is what sent us into slavery, and what caused us to be driven out the land is the things that we was doing in that era, which caused the Babylonians to come. Almighty Yah called Nebuchadnezzar and them to chase us up off the land. Now, if your history is not consistent with that, then you're not teaching real Israelite history. You can't go to the Assyrian era and try to teach Israelite history because it was never any lost tribes. Almighty Yah sent for the Assyrians to chastise the northern kingdom, meant to get the leaders and destroy them. Because they was doing Egyptian religion. I explained this in a whole lot of videos. But like I said, if you're not teaching from the book of Jeremiah and letting your history flow off of it, then you're not doing real Israelite history. You could teach from the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Isaiah, Acts, that was before the Babylonian captivity that would, lead up to it. But it has to be about the Babylonian captivity when you talk about Israelite history and how we broke the covenant. You can't just go into New Testament teachings and disregard the Tanakh history. It don't work like that. It's not real Israelite history that you're teaching. So if you want to teach real Israelite history, it has to be centered around we broke the covenant. Other than that, man, we not gonna never get it together, and we not gonna never have correct Israelite history. It's only one way to have correct Israelite history, is to teach that we broke the covenant during the Babylonian wars. That's the only thing that matters, because that's the only reason why we're not in the land right now. That's the only reason why we don't have possession of our heritage right now, is because we broke the covenant in the book of Jeremiah. It's that simple.